Disproportionate representation is at the forefront of special education. Currently, as well as in the past, special education has had disproportionate representation of students of cultured and ethnic backgrounds. The gap is greatly widening between minorities and Caucasian students in special education programs. First, let's explain disproportionate representation. Disproportionality is the over or underrepresentation of a given population group. This can include racial or cultural backgrounds, as well as gender and socioeconomic backgrounds. It is alarming to think that although our country has grown immensely since the 1960s, that we still struggle with overrepresentation of minorities in special education. Let's look back at Brown v. Board of Education from 1954. This court case abolished the idea of separate but equal schools. They determined it was unconstitutional to separate schools by race. This was the foundation for equal rights in schools and the beginning stages of special education. Brown v. Board of Education was the spark for civil rights. It made people realize that they do have a say and that government will listen to potential change in laws. Brown v. Board gave more power to the people, hence the beginning of special education. 7 years later, in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Act was established. This law was brought forth by President Lyndon B. Johnson. His goal was to give full educational opportunity to students. ESEA provided grants to schools who provided low-income students. Just a year later, students with disabilities were included in that law as well. It provided funding to states to help them further educate students with disabilities. In 1974, ESEA provided services and established the goal of full educational opportunities for all students with disabilities. In just 20 years, our country's education policy changed for the far better, with still much more improvement to be had. With the improvements made in the early 70s, laws were continued to be brought to the table to provide equal rights. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act established FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. The key word here is appropriate. FAPE established that all students with or without a disability will receive free public schooling at the expense of local education agencies. It also states that a child is entitled to appropriate education that fits needs and services stated in the IEP. It is designed to prepare the child for further education and independent living so they can reach their full potential. Finally, in 2004, IDEA, or Individuals with Disability Education Act, was developed. This law is current in today's educational laws. It has been amended and changed several times, but it states that all children with disabilities must be provided free and appropriate education. It is designed to fit the needs of a student, providing special services if the school receives public funding. Our country figured this out years ago. Why is disproportionate representation still a grave issue in special education? Why are minorities overrepresented? One reason for disproportionate representation in our schools is culturally biased assessments. Many times, when seeking special services, the assessments do not take into account of cultural differences or social or home life differences. This can greatly affect a student by subjecting them to lower level learning and taking them out of general education classes. Also, teachers may have a preconceived notion of a certain student. Through cultural biases or the deficit model, teachers may believe students to be in need of special services. Seeing the individual and accepting differences may have a large impact on disproportionate representation on minorities. A student who is an English as a second language learner may be misidentified by the school as SLD, but may just have a huge language barrier. Many times, teachers can get complacent when building relationships with students. Stereotypes and other biases perceive that student as receiving special services. But in reality, the teacher may just have to diversify teaching strategies and understand different learning styles of students. What can be done to decrease disproportionality in minorities? The key is to ending the negative trend in schools is developing a comprehensive approach for teachers to learn culturally appropriate instruction and assessments. Also, training people in people-first language and mentalities will go a long way. By also developing a strong collaboration of school and home life can decrease misrepresentation. By working together, guardians and schools can encourage positive learning environments that fit the needs of the student. This allows for IEPs to be granted to the student seeking special services. Information regarding disproportionate representation is extremely important. As educators, we must continue to bridge the gap between minorities and Caucasians in special education. Culturally focused assessments, observation, and collaborative work with guardians can go a long way to determine the services needed or least restrictive environment for that student. By continuing to misplace students in special education, it hinders the student's learning potential and provides a barrier between general education classrooms where optimal learning can potentially happen.